Hello, welcome to week 3 for Ministering in Traumatized Communities. This week will be on week 3, types of trauma. So we've already talked a little bit about what is trauma, the history of trauma, and also how trauma impacts the body. This week we'll be going a little bit more into detail on what types of trauma can exist. Some people think of just combat trauma. Some people think of things like assault or rape, but there's a wide variety of types of trauma. And then there's also a wide variety of ways to experience the trauma, how they happen in terms of recipient and in terms of also the temporal relationship. So let's get into that. Let's start with, what do we mean by trauma? Trauma is a word that's thrown around all over the place, and we talked in our first week about differentiating between trauma as a concept, meaning traumatic event, traumatic distress, and then there can also be resilience or post-traumatic growth. But how does one define trauma? People in the field of traumatology can sit in a room and debate this all day long, right? We can have fun with how we talk about it, and it depends on who you ask. If you ask the DSM, which is what we're using as therapists and clinicians to diagnose somebody, trauma is defined as an actual or an event where there was actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Therefore, a lot of other things that people consider traumatic outside of the clinical room don't count. But this definition is one that I like better. So if you look in your textbook by Gingrich and Gingrich, I always get this confused. Treating trauma and Christian counseling, I always get the names mixed up. Trauma results when stress overwhelms an individual's existing stress response system, inhibiting recovery from the stressor. So trauma is essentially something that is so big that it overcomes, or it's bigger than the individual's ability or group's ability to respond to that stressor. And that is what causes the experience of trauma. This event is too big for me to manage. I am helpless. What now? So let's talk about trauma in terms of who it happens to. So we've talked about it can happen directly or indirectly, or you can be exposed in different ways. Let's flesh this out a little bit more, okay? It can happen indirectly to an individual, so it can happen to you or to one person, right? Directly, they experience the car crash, they experience the assault. It happens directly to them. It can happen as a witness. You witness somebody being assaulted. You witness a shooting, right? It can also happen indirectly or vicariously. It can happen indirectly in terms of you hearing about it. It could happen by repeated exposure to hearing about it or repeated exposure to the aftermath of it. That would be an indirect experience or exposure to the traumatic event. It can also happen to a group of people. And these last three, they're all types of groups, but I want to differentiate a little bit. So it can happen to a group of people that happen to be maybe in the same place at the same time. You would think of something like a mass shooting. So these people might not have a relationship to each other, but they experience it as a group. They experience what happens as a group. Whereas a community is a group that lives together, works together, they are together, and they experience the trauma as a group. That's a bit different because they already have relationships in the group, so something happens to this community versus to this group. Another way is culturally. So people from a culture might live in a community, but they might not. So you think of people who have been, who are in a group as defined by a particular characteristic, perhaps their race or religion or their cultural background or their ethnicity. And it could happen to them as a culture. They might not be physically in the same space. They might not be living in the same community, but they might not, but they might. But it could happen to, or a culture or a group of people connected to the culture can experience it together. For example, I've used Black people seeing deaths on camera as an example. We're not in the same place. We might not even be living in the same community, but Black people all over the world or all over America are experiencing this traumatic event culturally. Okay, so now let's talk about trauma types by frequency. Okay, So I've already talked about the fact that you can experience a discrete trauma, which is it has a beginning and an end, or you can experience kind of ongoing trauma. Let's flesh this out a little bit more. So discrete or acute, those can be used synonymously. So you can have an acute trauma, which is one thing, happens one time, has a beginning and an end. You can have repeated acute traumas, so maybe more than one acute trauma. Maybe you have one or two. Or you can have an ongoing or protracted exposure to multiple traumas. Perhaps it's the same kind of trauma, but it happens over the course of years. I'm thinking about perhaps children who are sexually abused by an abuser, and it happens again and again and again and again and again for years and years and years. And then multiple, this could be repeat, but this could be multiple, like different kinds of trauma happening to the same person. So when I say repeated, sometimes I mean like it could be the same thing that repeats, right? So perhaps you are in a relationship of, and we call these, they used to call it DV, domestic violence, but now we say IPV, intimate partner violence, to expand the definition to include not just romantic relationships, but to include other kinds of things that happen. So there could be a person who gets hit once, acute trauma, maybe 3 times, repeated trauma, or maybe they're abused for the entirety of the relationship, an ongoing or protracted trauma. Or perhaps there's multiple. They are abused, and then they're in a car accident, and then they also experienced a war. So there's multiple different traumas. I hope that makes that clear. And then these last 3 in baby blue here are a bit more interesting, and they're not only protracted, but they happen in a way that the temporal quality is difficult to measure. So sometimes when you ask somebody on the first 4 when it happened, they can give you an answer as to when. But these last 3, some people can't quite have a when because they can't quite pin it down. And that's because they happened in ways where it might be hard to tell when it was happening, or they happened in such a way that it was the baseline for the existence. So let's start with the first one, insidious trauma. Insidious or systemic trauma. Insidious trauma has this quality, and I've attached some articles in the additional resources that address all of these for further reading if you're interested. But insidious trauma has this quality of these little tiny bits, and I believe somebody said death by 1,000 cuts, little tiny bits of trauma that add up to systemic harm, to big harm. And insidious trauma typically has something to do with being tied to your identity. So the insidious trauma that happens is not just random. It's not just little tiny things that are randomly happening. These are things like racism, oppression. They're tied to who you are, and it's little by little things that might not have a big blinking light on them, like somebody hitting you and you saying, oh, that's trauma, that is violence. This is things like microaggressions or macroaggressions or oppression or ethnoviolence, violence done to you because of your ethnicity. Okay, and so this insidious or systemic trauma causes ultimate harm, but it might not be easily recognizable. You might have a hard time pinning it down. And it matters for us to talk about this kind of trauma because people might feel traumatized and they can't quite put their finger on what happened. What happened to me? And why do I feel traumatized? And so people will have this experience of not being able to name it, or having difficulty identifying that they were a victim or a survivor of trauma. I prefer to say survivor. The next kind is developmental or complex trauma, and people use these terms interchangeably as well. This is when trauma happens so early on, it is kind of embedded in a person's very basic development. So this might be stuff like neglect or abuse or being separated from your family early on, attachment trauma where you're not able to attach to a caregiver and get that basic need of attachment. Attachment is a basic need. You might not be able to get that need met. So these things happen so early on that they impact your development, and so it's hard to put a finger on what happens sometimes because it happens so early on and so pervasively throughout the entire context of perhaps their childhood. And then we have generational, intergenerational, transgenerational. They might use different words, or we know also that this can be transmitted genetically, trauma. And so this is trauma that gets passed down, perhaps through the genes, through epigenetics, like we talked about last week, or even like you watched in those two videos, transmitted through families, right? Families and the culture of the family. Okay, so when I say culture here, I mean small culture, not necessarily broad culture, but the small culture of the family. And then we have trauma types by incident. And I'm going to save interpersonal because I'm going to go back there for just a moment. But we have interpersonal. We can have a disaster or an accident. This is something that could happen randomly. It could happen by a natural disaster, an act of God. It could be injury, um, anything that would be considered a disaster or an accident. And I have a list on the next page that we'll talk about as well. War or political terror. Things like being a refugee also count in this. So when we think of war, we might think of combat or the death or the injury that occurs there. But the other ramifications of war, or of what led up to the war or what followed the war, are also traumatic, but they don't get as much attention. Right? So we think about the political tension that led up to there being a war in the first place. And then, of course, we have the soldiers in the war, the people living around the area of the war, and what that does to them. And then we have perhaps the people that need to flee because of the war, the families that are separated because of the war, right? And what happens after that. We also have loss. And this could be, you might hear the word traumatic grief. When you lose someone, especially if it's sudden, that can cause a traumatic response or traumatic stress that can be overwhelming to the system. And sudden loss of not just life, but sometimes a job or a home, those can be traumatic as well. You think about the fires, and you have a home one day, and then you have no home, no belongings, no memories the next day. That can be very traumatic. So any kind of loss that is sudden or overwhelming in nature, the scope of loss is really big, can be traumatic. And then we have serious illness. And the video that you'll watch this week deals with this as well. Having or experiencing yourself, or indirectly, or just, again, these things can all be experienced through a variety of ways, from 2 slides ago. But having an illness that is difficult to overcome, that is particularly painful, that has a very difficult treatment, that involves loss that you don't get back, loss of vitality, loss of income, loss of your job, can be quite traumatic. And so I've had several clients where the trauma was a medical trauma. So perhaps a person had a sudden stroke, and then they lost their ability to talk and walk, and it was very scary and thought they were going to die. Another person that I've had, the illness, sure, that was traumatic, but what was even more traumatic was the treatment, the pain of the treatment, and the suffering and the isolation of the treatment. Yeah. And then we can have systemic or oppressive trauma. So this is things like, and I have it kind of in the last slide and this side, because I want to kind of explicate how this can happen a little bit more. So it can be things like racism. Those can be incidents of trauma. Those can be traumatic. And then there can be trauma that is race-based, and we call that ethno-violence. And those kinds of incidents are a little bit different in the sense that, yes, they are interpersonal, they happen between people, but then they can also be less direct. So perhaps I'm thinking of like being in a Nazi camp and knowing that somebody is coming, and maybe they haven't gotten to you, but they have killed other Jews in your neighborhood, right? And so there's that ethno-violence that's there, or the oppressive aspect of how laws have been changed so that these people can't vote and other people can vote, right? So these are types of systemic or oppressive traumatic events. And lastly, we have community violence. And community violence has to do with living in an area where there is regular threat or actual violence. And this is where I did a lot of my research when I was studying on how pastors can help in these particular areas. And one thing that I find very interesting is the broken windows theory, and how it was originally talking about how where there are broken windows or signs of violence, um, poverty, or crime, that there tends to be an increase in violence and crime. And so first, this was used to look at why is there more crime in this particular area? And then politically, it was used a few years later in New York to kind of justify over policing that area. And what I find particularly interesting is when some of the studies were looking at the kind of psychological well-being of the people in that area, and how there were higher rates of depression, and living in this place kind of communicated to the people, to go back one of these squares, that living in a place where there are regular broken windows and crime communicates to the people that you're not worth protecting, you're not worth the government coming in to fix that window, right? And so this can have a layered effect of trauma on a person. So now let's go to interpersonal. Interpersonal is a really, really broad category, but interpersonal trauma is the one that has the highest rate of, if you're exposed to an interpersonal trauma versus a different kind of trauma, that you will be more likely to have PTSD. And so people who, and especially if that interpersonal trauma is assaultative, and that means violent, right? So an interpersonal violent act is the most likely to result in PTSD. And so in interpersonal trauma, you can have everything from assault, abuse, bullying, IPV, intimate partner violence. Tons of things can happen between two individuals, or between one person and a group of people, or a group of people and one person. Things that happen between people count for that. So I got this out of a book that I use when I'm teaching clinicians about trauma, which is great. And I've actually linked it in the additional resources because I think it's an awesome resource in case you need to look something up. But here's just some examples. We have kind of these natural categories, natural causes of trauma examples, and then we have things that are caused by people. We have accidents that can happen, and then we have the intentional acts that can happen. And just look at the vast variety of things that can happen that we have here, and what that could look like, or what people in your congregation might be experiencing. Okay, so that's all that we have for today, because I have some other activities that I'd like you to do, and I'll be sure to upload the slides to Canvas.